here. We just hope he's not lost. But the weather shouldn't have been a problem for the first time in 4 or 5 weeks. Oh, wonderful. Well, we will wait for him, but I'm going to start out and kind of start us out this tonight's lecture. We are going to be taking a look at the public schools in demographics. John Logan, who will be joining us, is one of the great experts in this and one of the finest demographers in the United States. I'll introduce him when he arrives. Thrilled that he'll, we hope, be with us. We're going, as you know, particularly those of you who have been with us every week, looking at demography from the family to the workplace, to the schools, and then on looking to the state, the nation, and internationally. But we felt it was particularly important to look at one particular demographic that is much in the news now, particularly if you listen to the dismal fiscal condition of the states and the federal government, and yet the great Massachusetts and nationally into education, and particularly, as Governor Paul Patrick puts it, to close the gap between those who have been advantaged in the system and those who will really address that issue. I want to put it in context, however, because as we all know in this room, there's been tremendous discussion and tremendous pressure on schools, the output of the schools, either as measured by some standardized test, MCAS, or perhaps even better measures. But I think we all tragic gaps between what some of our kids get, often in inner city schools, and what the outcomes are for those children who are coming out of suburban schools. When I was doing the Urban Experience textbook, which was the textbook I did a few years ago, on urban problems, I insisted to my two co-authors that we have a chapter devoted to the public schools because it was so important. And in doing that, we put together a table which came from a number of various data sources about high school graduation rates, and these are from 2003 and 2004, and it shows the difference between the high school graduation rates by the time they would get to the 12th grade in central city schools, in the urban district, and in the suburban district surrounding the central city schools. And it's nice to know, for example, that if you are in the state of Florida, the gap between the graduation rate in central city districts and in suburban districts is essentially zero. That is about 51.6%. No, I'm not. About 51.6% of the kids are graduating on time in the urban school district, and about 53.1% in the suburban school district. So, rough parity. But if you looked at the nation, however, across the nation, about 57.5%, about 57.5% are graduating on time versus 73% in suburban districts. So a difference of almost 16 percentage points. And that's the gap that we want to talk about. The gap turns out, according to these data from the U.S. Department of Labor, to be largest in the state of New York. The graduation rate, on-time graduation rate, is under 40%, 39.8% for kids in urban districts in the state of New York. It's not just New York City, but in Buffalo and Syracuse, you name it. In suburban districts. Here in Massachusetts, it's still quite high. We're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th highest gap in the nation. 55.3% in urban school districts versus 77.8% in suburban districts. It's the difference between Brookline, Newton, Wellesley, Weston on one hand, and inner city schools such as those in Lawrence, Holyoke, where I was last week, Springfield, Lynn, Revere, or, for that matter, in inner city Boston. That is what this is all about. And what I hope we'll get into a conversation when John gets here is what's responsible for this. Because to a great extent, of course, most of the discussion has been about failing schools. Schools that are not working. Schools that seem to be working quite fine. We have some of the best educated young people in the world, according to some statistics here in Massachusetts, on average, but schools that seem to be failing in inner city neighborhoods. And I guess one of the questions that I want to raise, given that we're talking about demographics all through here, is how much of this is due to what's happening in the schools versus what's happening in the community, what's happening in the family, what's happening in the society more broadly, what's happening in the culture. Some year or two ago, I was invited to speak before of foundation leaders in Massachusetts. They included the presidents of the Boston Foundation, Catholic Charities, Combined Jewish Philanthropy, CJP, and the United Way, along with Myra Kraft, who's very deeply involved in this, the wife of Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots and the Revolution. And I was kind of asked at the very beginning, not knowing what I was supposed to talk about, if we could fund a project on something that would make Boston better, what would you have us totally prepared for this question? But when you're in front of people like that, you think fast. And I said, most of you know that we do a lot of work on housing. We do a lot of work on local economic development at the Dukakis Institute, the Dukakis Center. We do a lot of work in sustainability and transportation. And I think all of those things are important, but the most important thing that I think you should put your attention on is kids. And I went over to the board, and I put up a big circle on the board, and I wrote the word kids. And I said, now let's think about all of the ways, all of the influences on children. And I started drawing lines. Again, this was off the top of my head. And I said, here are the schools, here are the parents, here are the siblings, here are neighbors' children, here's the Boys and Girls Club, here's the United Way, here's the YMCA, the YWCA, here's a bowling league, here's a soccer coach, here's a hockey coach. And I told a story, which I may have mentioned in class, maybe not this semester, but last semester, about the single most overprivileged child on the face of the planet. Single most overprivileged child on Earth. A child who was fortunate enough to make the decision to be born into a family with two parents who were living together and had been living together for some time, married, both of whom had PhDs, both of whom had never had a moment of unemployment in their whole lives, a family which had an upper middle class income, living in a very fine community, with many books in the family, and a mother who, in fact, did clinical psychology, which may or may not be good. I'm not sure about that. Father was doing something else. This child not only had the benefit of growing up in the family as an only child, but when this child was ready to go off to a wonderful daycare center conducted by Harvard University, and this is a daycare center which actually had a PhD doctorate daycare teacher who would do such things as take the kids to the Harvard women's basketball games during the season and got the women on the Harvard basketball team to kind of be mentors to 3- and 4-year-olds. Guy kids up to the top of James Hall in William James Hall in Cambridge, having painted a target on the top of the building of the daycare center and had the kids point out where their daycare center was. Child who would go on not to public school but to private school at a very good elementary school Cambridge Friends School, a school where this white child, who was the son of a white Caucasian family, heterosexual family where both were PhDs, made him probably the smallest minority of children in that school. He was then turned out to be a very good soccer player, and so he started playing team soccer sports at the age of 4. Over his elementary school and middle school and high school life, he would have some of the best coaches you could imagine who helped not only teach him how to play soccer, but also how to behave, grow up, and be cooperative, collaborative. Spectacular high school, private high school, Buckingham Brown, where he was recruited. And at the end of that education, ended up going as a freshman to Northwestern University. This child is Joshua Charles Bluestone. I could think his father's income. Now, think about this child. The Boston Medical Center, BMC, and will go home this afternoon or this evening. Her or his mother or parents or guardians, and will be living on Geneva Avenue in Dorchester or another community in the inner city. And now what I want you to ask is, think of all the things you would want this child to have between the moment they got the day they turned 19, that might be some of the same life opportunities as Josh Bluestone. It is likely, not completely 100%, but it is likely that this child will have fewer books in their home. It is likely, much more likely, that this child will be living with a single parent. Much more likely that this child will not have the same medical care. It is likely that this child will not have the same option of having a daycare center staffed by a PhD psychologist. It is very unlikely that this child will go to private school. It's very unlikely that this child will have the ability to travel around the world. It is less likely that this child will be involved to the same extent in organized sports or organized activities of other kinds, despite the magnificent work done by wonderful organizations and nonprofits, including you who represent, I'm talking to the great foundations doing great work in the city. The other fact that I point to them is that the typical child who grows up in the United States will spend 17% of their waking hours in school, from the time they're born to the time they're 18. Most children get no schooling until they're at 5. Once they're in school, they go to school no more than 180 days. School any more than about 8 or 8:30 to about 3 in the afternoon. If you exclude the time when they're sleeping, and let's say that's 8 hours a day, the amount of time that they are in school by the time they're 18 is only 17%. Other to think about all of the other things that matter. That is the context, I think, that we have to think about schools. It is Hillary Clinton's statement that you are raised by a village, and all of the individuals in that village can play an important role. And that village is populated by more people with more skills in Josh Bluestone than in that little girl or little Avenue. Not always. And it seems to me, once we start thinking that way, we get a very, very different way of thinking about what we need to do and what these demographics mean. Because if you also look at these numbers, you'll find out that the differences in graduation rates are related to race and ethnicity. Again, looking at together by Gary Orfield, used to be at Harvard, now out in California, you'll find out that the highest graduation rates tend to be in places like Portland, Oregon, where the largest racial group is white, and the minority enrollment is only 38%. This is as of 2000, so the date is a bit out of date. And the graduation rate is nearly 72%, graduating on time. On the other hand, if you look at a community like Dade County, Florida, where the minority enrollment is 89%, and the largest is Hispanic, the graduation rate is only 52%. Or if you looked at Oakland, California, where the minority population is 94%, and the largest racial group is African American, the graduate is only 30.4%. 30.4% is largely minority community, where the largest minority group is black, of 30%, to a largely minority community where the largest racial ethnic group is Hispanic, and you're up to 50%, and then you go to a community which is largely white, with a very small, relatively small minority population of under 40%, and the graduation rate is 72%. So those are the kinds of things that we're hoping John Logan will be here to talk about, because he's prepared for us a pretty PowerPoint looking at these kind of factors. While we wait for him, what I'd like to do is turn the class back over to you and see if you have some questions or comments about this introduction or other matters that you'd like to take up. Right. There are a lot of kids who graduate and they do finish up their degree and not going to get a GED, and do it in 5 years or 6 years. They take off, there's illness in the family, they suffer illness, they fall behind and don't pass all their courses, they don't make it up in summer school, and therefore they still graduate, but they graduate, later. Many of these, however, end up not graduating at all from a regular high school, and I don't know the numbers, but I think about half of those that don't graduate ultimately get a GED, an equivalent degree. But it may take them 6-7 years to do that. And so they would not be included in these statistics. And then there are those who never complete at all. They never finish a high school degree. And I think we've already seen from other work that we've seen this semester that if you end up there, your life chances are really quite constrained. Over here. Tanya? Yep. Right. That may be polluting these statistics a little bit. But Andy Sum, who's on our faculty here and leads the Center for Labor Market Studies, did a report for I think it was the Boston Foundation last year, in which he's actually tracking individual kids. So he didn't care where they graduated from. They may have been in 19 different schools, but he was able to figure out whether they graduated, by the time they were 19. And what he found were staggering differences. So for instance, the probability of a white female who was in the Wellesley schools graduating within 1 year of her 19th birthday was something in the neighborhood of about 92 or 93%. The probability of a black child living in, I think it was Lawrence, graduating on time was about 12%. 12 versus 90. A black male. And the graduation rates for females tend to be significantly higher than black males, particularly in inner cities. So even taking into account moving, so if these statistics are slightly biased because you might have somebody who started in the 9th grade, they never seem to graduate because they drop out of the system, and you never see them 3 years later. Andy Sum's numbers take that into account. Chase.
I would also add that it's true that a lot of people move out of the city into the suburbs specifically for schools. A lot of parents that children
Yes. Right. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you raised this. If you didn't hear, the question is, graduation from high school may not be a very good measure of quality of either the education or the abilities of the student or the opportunities. Actually, here's the problem. I misspoke when I was reflecting on the work that Andy Sum did. Andy Sum's work was, what is the probability of a child completing college within 2 years of when they starting in the 9th grade. And the difference was 91 or 92% for the white female in Wellesley versus 11% for the black male in an inner city school. So it's actually getting closer to that. But you might also want to look at, you get lots of kids who graduate, but they graduate at different skill levels. They get past MCAS, which you now need to pass, but obviously some of those kids are going to come out with 4-point averages and great SATs, and others won't. And the question is, what is their opportunity set at that point? What kind of college do they get into? Do they get to college? Obviously, once you get out of the public school system, you're also concerned about who can afford to go on to college. I pointed out that when I was, I think I mentioned this in class, when I was a kid ready to go on to college, I ended up going to the University of Michigan in a day when the tuition for a freshman for the fall semester was $128, right? You had to pay books, and I think there was a $5 library fee, but it was $128. And I worked in a Ford plant, which was easy to do back then because in the 1960s, the auto industry was booming. They needed replacement workers, yay. We needed replacement workers during the summers, and so it was easy to get a job. In fact, the industry was booming so much that in 1964, when I was a junior, I had to work on Sunday, July 4th, 10 hours. Please, join us here. And I made enough money in that one shift, because it was triple time, to pay my entire tuition for the fall semester. The cost of coming to Northeastern University, if you pay full freight, including room and board, is upwards of $50,000. That kid, Josh Bluestone, who's now at Northwestern, rather than Northeastern, where it would have been free as a wonderful perk to me, I refer to my son, who's at Northwestern University, which is just Northeastern University, plus $250,000. Well, John Logan has arrived, and I am thrilled to see my friend John, and I'm going to give a very brief introduction and turn it over to you, and we have your slides all teed up for you. John and I have been friends for a number of years, and I hope he'll say just a little bit about a huge project that he's heading up this year, and I'm privileged to be on his advisory board, having to do with the census for 2010. But John completed his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, way back in 1974, the same year I completed my PhD at the University of Michigan. He is at Brown University now, and before that, for many years, taught at the university at SUNY, State University of New York at Albany, when I think we first met, and was also director of the Mumford Center for Comparative Urban and Regional Research, which is University of Albany, SUNY Albany's equivalent of the Dukakis Center, which I have the privilege of directing here. Since 2005, Dr. Logan has served at Brown as Director of Research Initiative on Spatial Structures in the Social Sciences, and he's co-author with Harvey Malach of Urban Fortunes, The Political Economy of Place, considered one of the finest urban books in sociology. With no further ado, Professor John Logan.